So my name is Andrew Owen. I'm the lead researcher at the Accessibility Observatory. We're a relatively small research group. We operate within the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. And our focus is on accessibility, access to opportunities, access to destinations. Our largest project is national in scope. We produce data sets that cover the whole country. We want to talk about that project, some of the interesting things we've learned from the most recent annual update to it that help us understand some things about COVID and how behavior changed during that time. I want to share some examples of how the data from that project is being used by our sponsoring partners, who are all state DOTs. And then I want to make sure that you all know where you can go to get that data and perhaps use it in some of your own work. That's one of our goals as researchers, is to help elevate the work of other researchers out there. And then we want to share some information about what I guess we can sort of consider a spin-off project, where we're taking our national scale tools and applying them in the Appalachia regional context through a project sponsored by the Appalachia Regional Commission. Saumya has been leading that effort. I'm glad she's here to share that work. And then we'll keep some time at the end for questions and discussion and any thoughts. So I'll jump into, first of all, accessibility. What is it? Accessibility is a word that it can mean lots of things in different contexts, and so I want to be really clear about what we're talking about here. You'll hear me use the word accessibility. You also hear me just say access or access to destination. I mean the same thing when using all of these terms. And that thing is the ease with which a traveler could reach valuable destinations. There's some really important components of this definition. First of all, we're talking about the ease of travel. Ease, of course, can be looked at as the inverse of cost. And so what we're really talking about is how hard, how expensive, how time-consuming is it to move around, not just to move around for movement's sake, but to actually get to things. There's a job out there, there's a movie theater, there's a restaurant. Is it close? Is it far? Is it expensive? Is it cheap to get there? In most of our work, that cost is expressed in terms of time, but you can undertake an accessibility study with cost expressed as money or exposure to safety risk. Lots of different ways to think about this. Impedance to travel is sort of the most generalized way of saying this. The other really important thing about this destination is that we're talking about potential trips. We're not looking at what did people do last week or last year or a decade ago. We're saying, given what the networks are right now, and given what the land use arrangements are right now, what travel is possible? And of course, there's always a lot more travel possible than is actually undertaken by any one person or even by the entire population on a given day or at a given minute. But what's possible constrains what happens. I like to say that it sort of sets the stage for the play that's enacted every day. And so if you set your stage and you've got a bunch of Scottish castles on it, the play that will happen will probably be Hamlet. If you want a different play to happen, you've got to change the set. And so access tells us what's the set that we're building, which will help us understand what sort of plays take place as travelers move around and reach things that they need to get to. So as an example of this, we can look at our own metro area here in Minnesota. How many jobs can be reached within 30 minutes by driving at 8 a.m.? And the map we're looking at here, it goes down to the individual census block level. And it says, it picks up that block, a location. It says, if you are at this place and it is 8 a.m. and you get in your car and start driving, how many jobs could you reach if you were able to split into a million different selves and drive all the roads at once? How many could you reach? We pick up that origin, and on this map, it'll be colored by the potential total number of destinations, the number of jobs reachable within 30 minutes by driving at 8 a.m. And you can see that it peaks in the core of the metro area because right there, you're close to all of the jobs. Access is then sort of distributed throughout the region by our road and highway network. And so you can see that it's high along highways that have connections to a lot of jobs. And this sort of illustrates the connection between the network and the land use that accessibility tries to make clear. In order to produce that kind of data and those kind of maps, we need a variety of different kinds of input information. We need to know, where are we starting? What are the origins? For our work, that's usually census blocks across the whole country, but you could talk about any points as origin. You need to know what the destinations are. In that example, it was jobs from the census's LEHD data set. But again, we could swap that out for any point data set that has a meaningful interpretation as a destination you might want to get to. Groceries, healthcare, schools, stuff like that. We need the network on which we're going to calculate travel times. In that example, we were looking at driving, so we need to have roads and speed information. If we were talking about transit, we need to know the transit network and the schedules. We might need to know about bike lanes. We might need to know about pedestrian networks. We need to pick a time of departure. It would be different if we measured it at 9 or 10 or 11 than it was at 8 a.m. The same is very true for transit. It's less true for biking and for walking when speeds tend to be the same at different times of the day. But departure time is important. And then we need to decide how we are implementing that ease component of the definition. In all the examples we're going to be talking about, the cost of travel is expressed as time. You'll see like jobs within 30 minutes. How long does it take to reach a healthcare facility, something like that. But these are all pieces that go into creating an accessibility metric. So we do this at the national scale, and we go through a series of steps to do an annual update to our national accessibility data set. We talked about collecting all that input data. This includes transit schedules from several hundred individual operators from urban and rural locations. We pull in the OpenStreetMap data set covering the whole country, census geography covering the whole country, jobs data covering the whole country from LEHD. And then a big part of this work is the travel time calculations. We build those network data sets into a couple open source tools without which we really wouldn't be able to do this. OpenStreetPlanner and R5 have been really foundational in being able to do this kind of travel time calculation at scale. We've done some of our own work to connect those tools with some of the different kinds of network data sets that we work with. Once we've got all that set up, we're able to run the calculations and say, for all of these origins we've defined, how far can you travel in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes, calculate those isochrones, and then turn those into access figures by intersecting the travel times with opportunities. Then for each mode, there's a variety of different processing steps we'll go through. Are we talking about individual departure times? Do we want to know about congestion in the case of auto? For transit, we'll average over time to reflect how transit schedules vary from minute to minute. That can make a really big difference. For bike, we might talk about different stress levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on the kinds of bike infrastructure and the traffic context that a cyclist is traveling in. So that's a bunch of processing that takes place. We've then got billions of data points at the block level per mode, per departure time, et cetera. And that's a lot to deal with. A lot of our partners in this work are state DOTs, and they want to talk about trends at the county level, at the MPO level, sometimes even at the state level. So we'll process that really detailed data into aggregated data sets, and then finally synthesize that and share the data sets, publish reports, which go to our sponsors and then are also published nationally, trying to get every year, we hope there's a more robust national conversation around access, why it's important, and how we might plan for it. So all of this takes place as a result of a really fantastic team of people that we've got together. There's myself, our lead researcher. Eric Lind is our director. Saumya Jain, our researcher, is here with us today. And then Shirley Liu has made some really key contributions, especially on the transit side of this, pulling together those hundreds of individual operator data sets. These are some great people to work with. I wish you could hear from all of them. Okay, so that's Access, a little bit about our group. I'd like to talk now about the National Accessibility Evaluation, and get into some of the latest findings and trends that we're seeing based on our most recent results, which describe conditions in calendar year 2021. We always lag a little bit because we have to wait for that whole list of data sets to be updated. The National Accessibility Evaluation is a pooled fund project. It's sponsored by a group of state DOTs, highlighted in green here, who have come together and said, access is important to us. We want to use it to understand our own performance as a DOT, how our work intersects with land use, and then track stuff over time. This is the 8th reporting year for the National Accessibility Evaluation Project. We're really excited to have these partners. We're always looking for more. If any of you want to prod your local DOT into getting in touch with us, we'd love to add new states to this list. So looking out at the big picture, we're looking here again at access to jobs. And we've calculated this for every census block in the country. We're focused here just on the continental US for a more legible map. A couple things to note here. First is that because of that big stack of data dependencies that we have, we sometimes inherit gaps from those data sources. So you can see that Arkansas and Mississippi are missing basically from this map. In the 2021 LEHD data sets, those states had not, or perhaps had not yet, reported local jobs data to the Census Bureau. And so where that job information is missing, it looks like in our data set, there is nothing that you can travel to in terms of access to jobs. So that's just important to keep in mind, that with a big project like this, we're going to inherit holes in our data just based on input data sets. Fortunately, this is really pretty rare, but when it happen, it's notable and it's important to call attention to. The second is that, at least the way it's visualized here, access can sometimes really call attention to the differences between urban and rural areas. And it kind of makes sense. In a way, access is what defines urban versus rural. A place with really high access is a place where there's a lot of stuff close together. That's an urban area. A place with low access is a place where there is a lot of space in between things. Things are further apart. That's a rural area. We try as best we can to stay away from access is good in this location, access is bad in this location. There are lots and lots, millions upon millions of people in this country who specifically choose to live in low access places because there's all sorts of nice things about it. There's more room, there's not as much traffic congestion, there's more open space. So I sometimes worry that maps like this come out as a value judgment of like, it's better to be in a red place. We're just trying to describe, is this a location where there's a bunch of stuff you can get to quickly, or is it a place where things are more spread out and it takes longer to travel to things? I lost my keyboard. There it is. All right, so we take that those national data sets. That was the auto example. We've got the same data for transit, for biking. And we turn it into our Access Across America series of data sets and reports. Now in this, we do end up with a really urban focus. The goal of these reports is to get that national conversation about access going. And nothing gets national conversations going like rankings of metropolitan areas. So that's what we do. We summarize our access data up for the top 50 metro areas in the country in these reports, and then we can track how they change year over year. The rankings will jostle around. We can sometimes connect them with specific infrastructure projects, or like interstate bridge closures will show up on our access maps, so we can connect them to real things that are happening out in the world. We'll produce the same maps and scorecards for each of those metro areas, allowing you to compare and contrast, like, wow, this place is higher, this place is lower. Provide some key statistics for each of those areas. And then, of course, that ranking that I mentioned is always really interesting. People like to look at this. So I want to dig a little bit into what we've seen, particularly related to COVID transit use and transit access. 2021 was I should say that our annual updates, our measurements reflect conditions at the very beginning of that calendar year. So our 2020 data is effectively pre-COVID because it says what was happening in like the January, February timeframe. 2021 then is like 11 months into the COVID pandemic and gives us a really clear view of like what things were as we were sort of digesting what's normal, where are people working, who's traveling. And there's some interesting things to see related to particularly transit and auto. Bike is a little bit less interesting, but we'll take a look at each of these. So, okay, I'm going to take off the access hat for a moment because the data we're looking at right here is ridership. This is behavior. It's not potential trips, it's actual trips. This graph starts at the very end of 2019. 2019, that was December 29th, 2019. We can see as 2020 happens, suddenly transit ridership just plummets. Well, that was COVID. Since then, it's been gradually ticking slowly upwards. This is the year that we're looking at, 2021. So transit ridership basically disappeared. We can ask, why did ridership disappear? This is an important question in an access context because sort of the theories of access would predict that you'd see a ridership response like this or a usage response of a transportation mode when the mode itself changes. If transit suddenly becomes less useful, if we cut routes, cut service, then ridership would drop. That makes sense. Is that what happened in this case? It turns out that it's not. We want to know about this because there was a lot of conversation, especially in that first year of COVID, about essential jobs, essential workers. Who was it who was able to switch to telecommuting or have their job just didn't happen? They weren't commuting for some reason. There were a lot of people who were still commuting. And these were people who often depended more on transit, I don't know if that's a question or just an open mic. Okay, I'm going to keep going.
Hey, everybody, please make sure that you're muted. Sorry, Andrew.
That's okay. We've all done that as well. So we really want to understand, like, was this just that people stopped using transit because it wasn't useful, or were they changing behavior for other reasons? When we look at access, what we see actually is that transit accessibility didn't drop during COVID. It stayed the same, or in a lot of cases actually increased. Only in 4 cities of those top 50 did transit decline more than 10%. So the surface level answer to that question of why did transit ridership drop was it wasn't due to a change in the transit networks. It was due to something else. We, of course, know that the something else was COVID, but we can look at what was being provided in terms of transit because it was still very useful for people who were still needing to travel. Because we've got this really detailed coverage of transit access, we can also look within urban areas and say, well, where did transit change? And it turns out, this is a local example, but this story turns out to play out pretty similarly across the country, that agencies prioritized preserving service in core areas. And if there were cuts, it was usually in suburban areas, which is exactly where the riders were that suddenly could telecommute. So places where transit agencies did make schedule adjustments, it tended to be really surgical, targeted at exactly the routes that stood to lose the largest number of riders, and they preserved routes that maintained the largest number of riders, preserving access for those people who were still around, still needed to get to jobs using transit. That's a really good thing to see. But it didn't happen just sort of automatically. It happened because we decided we want to invest money in preserving this transit service. The CARES Act provided a huge infusion of funds across the country for transit operators to keep running their systems. It turned out to be really important for workers that still needed to travel to jobs. But it's not automatic that this will just keep happening. It'll keep happening as long as we decide that it needs to keep happening. We're now looking at questions like, well, ridership hasn't recovered to what it was before COVID. Does that mean that we've got funding cuts coming up where we are going to decide, okay, now we want a less useful transit system because people haven't been using it as much? This varies from agency to agency. Some agencies are much more dependent on direct revenue from ridership to maintain their services. Some are less. Agencies where that link is the strongest, where ridership equals revenue, are places where we see the greatest risk of service being reduced, the transit system being made less useful for those people who are continuing to use it. And this is something that we'll be keeping an eye on in future installments of the National Accessibility Evaluation. So we can look then at auto. Did we see the same sorts of patterns, the same relationship between, we can talk about drivership, like we talked about ridership. A couple of background pieces of detail about our auto calculations. We calculate auto access using observed speeds by individual road segment. This comes from TomTom. We get a lot of detail on the road network. The fact that it's observed speeds is important. This isn't just a model based on roadway classification. This is what were people actually doing. And so it'll show up in behavior shifts really clearly. What we see is that there's a feedback that exists in auto access and drivership, or between auto access and drivership, that doesn't really exist between transit access and ridership. So we're looking here at, sorry, the title here is Access Time of Departure. This is a traffic volume by time of day. This is a local example. The same trends exist really sort of across the country, comparing the expected pattern of traffic volume over time of day. That's the dotted line, with observed in 2021, and that's the blue line. Our calculations are mostly done at 8 a.m., sort of the a.m. peak travel time. What we can see is that there's a reduction in the peaks of traffic volume out there. It sort of spread things out through the day. We see more traffic volume at midday. But that peak reduction is really important. It shows up really clearly in the access data sets. When you've got fewer people on the road, the remaining people on the road can drive faster. Faster speeds mean higher access. So you end up with this loop where fewer people using the roads sort of paradoxically makes the roads more useful for everyone who's left using them. We didn't have that feedback with transit. Fewer people were using transit, but the usefulness of transit stayed the same. It didn't get better because fewer people were using it. In fact, we're worried that it's going to get worse because fewer people are using it. With roads, that feedback loop runs the opposite direction. Because speeds are higher, access is higher. So we actually saw that auto access, not traffic volumes, obviously far less fewer people were driving, but auto access soared in 2021 over 2020. So looking at Boston, a really congested metro area, you can reach, sometimes, depending on your location, 50% more to twice as many jobs by driving at 8 a.m. than you could in 2020. That's an enormous change that's driven almost exclusively by behavior change. Fewer people on the roads, uncongested travel speeds. Suddenly the road network is more useful to those people who do use it. We saw the same pattern play out all over the place in Florida, even, or really especially in Los Angeles, which is a place where congestion is like the critical constraint on auto access. You take away that constraint and access just explodes. You can suddenly drive anywhere within Los Angeles County within 30 minutes. So auto access rose in every one of the top 50 urban areas. 17 cities saw at least a 50% increase averaged over the whole city. In San Francisco and Los Angeles, aggregate access averaged over the whole metro area doubled over 2021. Those are places where really this is indication of how constrained were you by congestion. The bigger the increase you saw between 2020 and 2021, the more congestion was impacting you before COVID. So this was a behavior change, a reduction in drivership, people out there on the roads. One of the things that we know, relating this back to like, well, who does this matter for? There's a really strong link between household income and being able to switch to telecommuting. So once you get up to a household income of like 100,000, then about half of those households, and increasing going up, about half of those households or more had a worker who was able to switch to telecommuting, and it drops off really fast as you decrease in household income. People still needed to travel. So for people who still needed to travel, who tend to be lower income, the transit network retained the same level of usefulness, and the auto network became much more useful. Can we sustain this? One of the things that you can look at this data as sort of a joking way and say, well, okay, we fixed congestion. We're done. All we need to do is keep people off the roads. We don't want to do it by getting them all sick, but are there other ways? Could we sustain this behavior change? Well, what it comes down to is there something else useful to do besides driving? For a bunch of people, we found out that telecommuting is a useful option. It's not ideal in some situations, but there's a lot of signs that there's going to be a stickiness to telecommuting to some degree. It will be a much larger part of work life than it was pre-COVID. So we provided a useful new option. We're seeing, though, that people are already complaining about like, oh, well, everyone's getting back on the roads and now traffic is bad again. Well, the question to ask here is, what else are we providing? And Access is sort of teed up to answer that question. Are we providing transit networks that provide useful alternatives to driving? Are we arranging things? Are we making infrastructure investments so that biking or walking is a real useful alternative to driving? The big takeaway for me is that if you want fewer people on the roads, you need there to be something else to do. And we need to have decided to and to create that. If we decide not to, if we don't make that investment, that's a decision we can make, but then we shouldn't go complaining that everyone's driving again. This will be really interesting to see how it plays out in different locations as transit networks, as investments, as policies respond to really everyone sort of reevaluating how and where they're commuting, how frequently. It's going to be an interesting few years coming up. I said I'd mention bike. One of the things that I want to mention about our bike approach is that we try to reflect different levels of traffic stress as people bike in different contexts, whether you're at LTS4, you're like, I'm just a hardcore cyclist. I'm going to bike in a traffic lane on a busy street, all the way to LTS1, where you've got a separated bike lane that's physically apart from a roadway. And then we've got grades in between there. We calculate access differently or separately for each of these, then we can compare and contrast between them. For bike, we didn't see these different kinds of feedbacks like we did for transit and for auto. And that's sort of a reflection of the way that our bike networks work. We might have seen more people actually biking, but there wasn't a change in access. We didn't suddenly gain a lot more space on our bike paths. We didn't suddenly gain a lot more bike paths. But there is a lot of evidence that we saw behavior changes. Within the bike mode, though, those behavior changes don't feed back into access the way that they did with auto. So really across the country, we saw some modest increases, mostly due to job growth in bike access. All right, so that's a look at what we're doing within the National Accessibility Evaluation. I want to give just a couple really short examples of how some of our partners use this data, and then make sure that you guys know how you can get your hands on it before we talk a little bit about the Appalachia Regional context. So I mentioned that our project is sponsored by state DOTs. Those DOTs get our detailed block level data sets. They also get some customized sets of summarized data sets and reports to allow them to track trends within their own jurisdictions. We've seen our partners, this is the Minnesota Department of Transportation, start to adopt access as a performance measure. MnDOT calls it out as one of the things on which they score themselves. They track it year over year and see if it's going up or down for different modes. Massachusetts has taken our access data and put it in this dashboard, which is focused on access to jobs by different modes. This had a particular focus on congestion. But we really like the way that they made this visible and then sort of part of a larger GIS dashboard and library for people visiting their site. Maryland is another of our partners and found our bike access, in particular LTS network information, really useful in assessing how well they were providing bike access in different parts of the state. And they found that this had a really big benefit in their competitive grant application process. They would use it to support federal grants saying, hey, we really want some funds to improve bike access in this location. And we've got this data that shows it's really low because we're lacking our safe infrastructure investments. So they found it really helpful in the competitive grant process. We're hoping that this data will be useful for you as well. The data from the NAE are mostly publicly available. The big asterisk on the mostly is related to auto data. I mentioned we use data from TomTom. They're a commercial source. They're not just giving us the data. It's licensed by each of the state DOTs that participate. So we can share auto data for those states that are participating. We can share transit and bike for anywhere in the country. Those are all open data sources. You can visit our website, access.umn.edu, and that'll help you navigate to data sets for different years. This will go all the way down to the block level if you want it to. I hope you'll take a look and see if it's useful for any curiosities that any of you might have. All right. The last thing that we want to share with you all is work that we're doing for the Appalachia Regional Commission, where we're taking that national scale access evaluation framework and then applying it to the Appalachia context, while also expanding the set of destinations that we're talking about beyond jobs, working with things like healthcare and education. So I will, at this point, hand off the presentation to Saumya. I'm going to stop sharing. She's going to start, so bear with us for a slide transition.
Just want to make sure if my slides are visible. Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. So bear with me. I have a sore throat today, so if I have to pause to get my voice back, just bear with me. So we heard Andrew talk about the NAE Pool Fund study. And now this is about the Access in Appalachia pilot implementation project. I know it's a mouthful. We're going to say the pilot for this presentation. So in this pilot, we're going to use everything, all the good things that Andrew talked about, the networks, all the components, all the destinations, and take everything, all the modes, and apply it to the Appalachian context. We're using all our past experiences or leveraging everything that we know from the NAE and in a way overlaying it on the Appalachian region. Within this project and also within the NAE, we try and maintain transparency and reproducibility. So we try to make products that are easy to replicate. We do that, as Andrew's already mentioned, with a lot of open source data sets and routing engines. Now, specific to the ARC access project, we are going to measure access to multimodal access to education, healthcare, and entertainment. And we're adding this to the job metrics that we initially established in the NAE study. We're also measuring auto access to intermodal freight facilities. And again, when I say multimodal, I mean access to jobs, education, healthcare, and entertainment by auto, by transit, and by biking. I mentioned transparency and replicability being important aspects of this project. Now, keeping those two in mind, we conducted a thorough search for open source destinations that could effectively, we could use to measure access to all of these bigger destination buckets. And everything that you see under the buckets are destinations that we found that were consistent across the ARC. So, and as you saw earlier, ARC consists of 13 states. So basically, we're working with national data sets on all of these destinations. Now, for defining these metrics for the NAE, like Andrew talked about, we work with number of jobs accessible within, say, 30 minutes, within 60 minutes. For the ARC context, where we're interested in understanding access to both urban as well as rural areas, we're measuring access to the nearest for all of these destinations. And when I say nearest, I mean travel time, measuring travel time to, say, the nearest trauma care center, to the nearest sports venue. Now, we're also measuring access to the third. For example, measuring bike access to the third school. That means if someone could access 3 public schools within 10 minutes, they can also access the first and the second public school within those 10 minutes. Now, when we measure access to the third, we want to keep choices available for destinations where having multiple options could be critical. Now, the Appalachian region, what you see on the right, much like the US, it's very vast and exhibits varying population densities and distributions, also has a lot of diverse points of interests. Those points of interests in this study are destinations. These disparities that we see around the ARC region as well as the US can be delineated by urban or rural nature of places, something that Andrew touched upon. Or we can also examine them through a more nuanced lens, say considering economic distress or vulnerability. This is something that the ARC focuses on. So our multi-destination, multimodal metrics can actually contribute to these definitions, and facilitate a better understanding of how access can be associated to these distinctions. Now, most access research, as I said, is focused on urban context. With this pilot, we're interested in seeing how it also, affects the rural areas. Now, let's get into some visualizations using the results from our pilot and see how it changes between a rural example versus an urban example within the ARC. Now, in this comparison, we're looking at Allegheny County, which is home to Pittsburgh on the left, and Randolph County, which is home to Elkin on the right. They're very different in nature. One is primarily rural, and the other is situated in a notably rural area of ARC. Our focus here is on bike access to the third nearest high school in both of these counties. Now, in Allegheny County, if you see on the left, one can reach 3 high schools within a 60-minute biking radius from most of the blocks. On the right, we have Randolph County, where only a limited number of blocks can access high schools that are again limited within a 60-minute biking ride. Now, this is based on biking on all roads. Andrew had mentioned we measure access by LTS 1 through 4. So what you see here is using roads that are categorized under LTS 4. So medium to high stress roads, all roads except highways and freeways. However, if we were to measure access by just, low stress roads, this access would diminish significantly. Now let's switch modes and look at transit. Again, I like to go back and forth on these maps and see how much access reduces when we switch the mode from biking to transit. Now, this variation can stem from the availability, or also one might say the absence of transit services in these areas. Now, even though transit access isn't as high as bike access for Allegheny County, there are still blocks within Allegheny County that can reach 3 high schools within 60 minutes. On the right, in Randolph County, there's a handful of blocks that can do that within 60 minutes. Now, it's worth noting that our transit access calculations also include walking as an egress mode. So it effectively makes this access a walking plus transit access. So what we see on the right could just be walking access if there isn't a fixed route transit. So these calculations, again, are something that is telling us the availability of opportunities. We're not looking at travel behavior here, although those two are very much connected, as the former can impact the later significantly. Now let's shift our focus to some healthcare destinations. In this context, we're examining urgent care facilities and access to those by driving within a 60-minute window. Now, this looks good. Almost all the blocks within these counties can access urgent care facilities within a 60-minute driving window. Most can reach these facilities within 20 minutes. See how drastically access changes. We're still looking at urgent care facilities, but we're looking at transit access within 60 minutes. Now, we can see what was very easy to reach within 20 minutes of driving becomes challenging to reach by transit even in 60 minutes. On the North Allegheny County side, you can see that it's not even accessible within 20 minutes. If you observe the map on the right, only a few blocks can access urgent care facilities. Now, this can again just be walking access. But here on the left, access is still, you can still see blocks that are not next to, not neighboring these urgent care facilities and can still access them. Especially if you notice on the left here, there are areas that show the access for these urgent care facilities is within 10 minutes. Those just could be bus stops that have direct access to one of these facilities. Now let's zoom out a little bit and look at trauma care centers. This is driving access by trauma care centers. On the left in Allegheny County, we can see its trauma care centers are accessible within 60 minutes. But it might take someone 5 times higher to reach a trauma care facility if they were here compared to if they were here. Now, for example, if someone had a trauma emergency in one of these locations, or even up here in North Allegheny County, they're at a much higher risk of not making it in time compared to someone who needs the same care but is located closer to the closer to the trauma care facility. Now, for both of these maps, we can also notice how the urban Allegheny County on the left is served by almost 5 to 6 trauma centers, but Randolph County is only served by 1 trauma center, and it's sharing it with a nearby county. Now, we just looked at a very few examples, but there is just so much more that can be done with these block level access metrics. Once we share these with the ARC, they can employ these metrics to identify gaps in access, gaps in infrastructure, identify healthcare deserts, identify education deserts, employment deserts, as well as strategize bridging these gaps with a combination of land use and transportation. Now, we can also aggregate these block level metrics. Since we are measuring access at the lowest census level, we can aggregate these up to, say, block groups, tracts, counties. And once we do that, we can use these aggregations to compare counties across the region. We can see how urban versus rural counties are performing, how economically distressed counties are performing. All of these comparisons can greatly help in answering where funds are most needed, something that the ARC is hopeful in using these analyses for. Now, although this data set in itself is very rich. More open source data can mean more such metrics. Now, I just want to remind what Andrew had already spoken about. I've shared a link in the chat to access these reports and data sets. Let us know if you have any questions on either the NAE data sets or the ARC pilot project. We're here for questions.